Within seconds, I was standing like a burning torch in our living room. Then there was this inconceivable moment when I realized I'm going to die, because I couldn't breathe anymore and the fire was everywhere. I was breathing in flames.
Ms. Evertz, a number of years ago, you had a near-death experience about which you have already reported several times. I would like to talk to you about a few of your experiences and insights in more detail. However, first, I'd like to ask you to describe the events that happened at the time, once more.
Ja, es war ungefähr vor 10 Jahren, dass ich beim Kamin anzünden aus Versehen einen falschen Anzünder gegriffen habe, und zwar Ethanol, und das kam an meine Kleidung.
About 10 years ago, I took the wrong lighter by accident, namely ethanol. It seeped into my clothes. My clothes caught fire. I tried to extinguish the fire by beating my clothes with my hands, but it had the opposite effect. The flames just became bigger and higher. So eventually, my arms, my hands, and my upper body were burning. Within seconds, I was standing like a burning torch in our living room. Then there was this inconceivable moment when I realized I'm going to die, because I couldn't breathe anymore and the fire was everywhere. So I couldn't breathe in anymore. I was breathing in flames. This very moment, I offered myself to a greater power. There were these thoughts popping up like, Father, do whatever you want to me. Whatever happens, I'm giving myself completely into your hands. At that moment, I was catapulted out of my body. All of a sudden, I was situated 2 meters away from this burning body. I looked at this body and saw that my hair was on fire and how the high ceiling was turning black from the soot. I was watching as this body suddenly started to stagger and reel. And all of a sudden, I felt completely neutral. It was a thrilling moment. I was just waiting for what would happen next. And then I noticed that my son was rushing into the living room and he jumped on my body. The emergency physicians came, and then we were heading to Munich by helicopter. However, I'd been present the whole time, meaning I did exist twice. Firstly, there was that body that needed care and was carried into the helicopter under anesthesia. Secondly, I was there myself and watching as the emergency physicians compassionately took care of me, checking my well-being at all times.
So you experienced the emergency measures from out of your body?
Yes, and I felt completely neutral. I didn't know what had happened to me at all, and I hadn't given much thought to the idea that I could be dead. That came later in the hospital in Munich. I was wondering why the doctors were so hectic. I then watched them as they were bringing this body to the emergency room and how they were performing first aid on it. I then realized that I knew all the thoughts of these doctors and what they were feeling. Only in Munich I noticed there must be something wrong with me. I then realized that this matter wasn't a problem for me anymore. Well, that I could put my arms through walls if I wanted to. And I was really confused. Some time later, I don't even know how much time had passed, my body was lying there. They had put it into a twin room in the emergency ward, and there it was, already attached to tubes. It was lying there as if it was sleeping. I realised that I wasn't really interested in it anymore, that I barely felt connected to it, that I was very confused because I was thinking, man, things must continue somehow. There must appear a tunnel or a bright light or something along those lines. There's something that should happen when you're dead. Nothing was happening at first.
Why were you thinking that? Did you know accounts of people who had experienced something similar?
Yes. I was raised by my parents to believe that we have more than one life, and that everything has a meaning. I never understood the meaning in my own life, but it was clear to me that we'd have more than one life. I already knew that. My father had told me a few times that people are often pulled through a tunnel. I was waiting for that tunnel, but it never came.
Und es dauerte gefühlt sehr lange, bis ich plötzlich in diesem Krankenhauszimmer.
It felt like a really long time until all the matter completely changed all of a sudden. And something happened unexpectedly. I realised that the room was expanding. Everything was illuminated by light. It also looked a bit as if the walls were shimmering like a rainbow. It's really hard to describe. Suddenly, I heard a voice speaking to me. It was the very first time I realised that I was being watched or that somebody could see me. Then I discovered a very tall, light being in this room that reared up in front of me, became clearer and clearer, and it eventually said to me, Anke, there isn't anything left for you to do here. I'd like to take you with me. I'd like to show you something. I thought this was really great at that moment. I didn't have any connection to this material level anymore. I was extremely touched because this light seemed very human, well, really personal, very loving and soft. It seemed masculine to me. It came towards me, hugged me, and pulled me out of hospital. He took me with him. I've called him teacher ever since. It was like a hug. Everything was fine from that moment on. Everything fell off me. This complete tension, this insecurity regarding what was happening to me here. I actually had the feeling that I'd arrived.
Were you conscious the whole time? From the time you began feeling the flames up until the moment you departed from your body? Or are there gaps in your memory?
No, I was conscious the whole time. I even had the feeling that I was more conscious than ever before. One factor I find the most incredible by today's standard is that I felt exactly the same in my body as before. I had the feeling I had a form, I had legs, I had hands, I had eyes from which I looked out of. The big difference was that I sensed a lot more. Feelings and sounds that I wouldn't have been able to hear with my human senses. I was able to hear and perceive these feelings. All this matter, which wasn't dense matter in this state anymore. I was constantly conscious.
You mentioned that you were able to put your hands through the wall. Could you feel any resistance?
I didn't try and go through the wall, but I tested how my body would react to the bed. I was lying there and sat down on the bed at the bottom end of my body. And I was surprised that I was able to sit down on the bed because at the same time I was able to go through the bed. And at that moment I realized, wow, I seem to be able to control this. Or also that I was standing on the floor, but actually I would have been able to go through the floor if I'd wanted to. It was pretty crazy. And completely different to the human world here, where matter is dense. Here it wouldn't be possible. There is nothing we can go through. That's when I realized that it depended on me, whether matter was dense, and whether I was able to stand on the floor. I think I would have been able to go through it, but I didn't try it.
During your experience, you left behind the hospital. What happened next?
At first, I was incredibly happy, because initially I'd focused my attention on this body in this room, and I was pulled out of this hospital. I saw Munich from above. It was dark. It was night. I realized that as a human, I'd say I was able to breathe in deeper and deeper. I was able to expand more and more weight and ballast. All this insecurity fell off me. Eventually, I focused on the areas I was pulled towards. I assumed it would pull me up, but today I'm not quite so sure about it. I felt lighter. The hug with my teacher made me feel incredibly secure and protected. I refueled. At first, my teacher brought me to a level that only consisted of light, a lively light. It wasn't like a light we know here, but a light that was full of sounds and where feelings could be sensed. It was a light that seemed to contain everything that exists. That was completely new to me. My teacher calmed me down and told me to take my time to get used to this energy, to this high frequency of light. I was also pretty excited that I was able to stand, that there seemed to be a floor. He even showed himself to me in the form of a light being. But he didn't explain to me really who he was. Interestingly, I always had the feeling, now I'm at home. Now I've arrived wherever in this light. There was always this question in me, am I dead? He then explained to me that I wasn't dead. How can I describe this? But that it was about showing me something. Then this life review began. He showed me my life.
Und da mein Leben sehr geprägt war von extremen Erfahrungen, von sehr viel Trauer, sehr viel Einsamkeit.
Because my life had been marked by extreme experiences, by a lot of grief, loneliness, losses, and several phases where I had wished for my own death. He showed me the experiences I'd had in my life, starting from my birth and ending at the moment I arrived in hospital. and he explained the connections to me. The crazy thing I noticed was that every time I relived a situation, I seemed to experience everything at the same time. For example, when I had a conversation with my father, I could sense the feelings of my father. I knew why he was acting the way he was acting. I could feel my own feelings and everything at once.
Und all das zeitgleich. Und das wurde dann sogar noch mehr, weil ich dann gezeigt bekam, auch wenn ich eine andere Entscheidung getroffen hätte in dem Moment.
And this increased even more because I was shown that if I or my father had made a different decision at that moment, something would have happened differently.
Hätte sich etwas anderes ereignet.
And I could perceive this as well. It was so multidimensional. It was like holograms that opened up, and you were able to zoom in as if with a microscope, and you'd capture everything simultaneously. If I tried to describe it briefly, I'd say I completely comprehended my life review.
When you dipped into these life situations, was there also some sort of an evaluation?
My whole life I thought the way I was wrong, and that I should do something or change something to be proper.
Und ich muss irgendetwas tun oder ich muss irgendwas anders machen, um richtig zu sein. Und ich hatte immer Angst vor Bewertung und habe dort festgestellt, dass es von außen.
I'd always been afraid of evaluations, and I realized that any form of evaluation from outside didn't exist there. Everything was carried by this unconditional love, by this freedom from value judgment. However, I realized that I evaluated myself. But that's the wrong word. I was deeply moved by how badly I'd treated myself, how hard I'd been on myself. I was very sad when I looked at myself in different situations, why I hadn't had the courage to change things, why I'd put myself down, why I'd lost myself more and more during my lifetime. That made me really sad.
Did you also perceive your behavior towards others differently in the light of these experiences?
Ja, ich war nie ein böser Mensch. Also ich habe nie irgendetwas getan, was anderen wirklich wehgetan hat.
Yes, I'd never been a bad person. I'd never done anything that really hurt others. There was this one situation. My little brother really wanted to play with me. He's 6 years younger than me. I was annoyed about something at the time and slammed the door in his face and pushed him away. At that moment, I could feel how rejected he felt, that he hadn't meant any harm, that he just wanted to spend time with me. I felt so sorry. Although this incident wasn't really that bad, I felt so sorry for him. And even then I got the feeling I'd like to make this right again if I could.
You mentioned that you experienced important events up to your birth. Was it like a chronology, where you moved from the present tense back to your birth? Or did you experience everything at once?
It wasn't chronological.
Das war vor allem, da es so multidimensional stattfand.
It happened multidimensionally, where every little moment had a cause, and this cause, even if it had happened years ago, was perceptible simultaneously. I've got the feeling that I could sense and experience everything simultaneously. And comprehend it for myself. I just can't describe it. Everything was the result of those various situations. During those 9 days, it also continued in a way that former lives started playing a role too. So that situations in my current life made sense once again.
You mentioned 9 days. Your body was put in a coma for 9 days.
Mein Körper wurde ins Koma versetzt für 9 Tage.
My body was put in a coma for 9 days. I was further away from my body than ever before.
Denn je, ich war heilfroh aus diesem
I was so glad I'd come out of its confinement. I wasn't interested in it at all. I also don't know how long this near-death experience took. I know that shortly before I was woken from my coma, I was asked by my teacher whether I wanted to go back into this body. That's why I assume it took 9 days.
The way you described your life review and your experiences, it sounds like you experienced timelessness.
Ja, man hat überhaupt kein Zeitgefühl. Die Zeit spielt dort auch überhaupt keine Rolle.
Yes, there was no sense of time. Time didn't play any role, neither did space. Because everything appeared simultaneously. The incredible thing was that as soon as you thought of a question, or as soon as you considered a thought or an impulse, all the answers popped up in front of you. It depended on what you focused on. If you wanted to find out, why did I suffer so much? Or why was I so hard on myself? At that moment, all the answers would emerge. It was like a hologram that opens up to you. You recognized all the connections in a single moment.
Was there something during this light tour that turned out to be an outstanding realization? Something you took with you?
Ja, ich war als kleines Mädchen immer schon sehr kreativ und ich habe als kleines Mädchen schon sehr viel wahrgenommen.
Yes, even as a small girl, I used to be very creative and I sensed a lot. But I was taught to let go of this. I was always told nobody's interested in what you sense, what you've got to tell.
Und ich habe durch diese Rückschau gemerkt, dass ich mich
In this life review, I realized that during my life, I cut off myself from this spiritual quality more and more, that I tried to function more and more and adapt to this society, that I became more and more unhappy. Eventually, I stopped asking myself, what makes me actually happy? Who am I? How would I like to live my life? I did everything to please the outside world. This was emphasized in several situations. Again, there was a situation where I thought, oh God, that's so sad, it's such a shame. And how wasted this life is. For example, I put a lot of emphasis on material things. I was quite wealthy at the time when this happened. I drove a fancy car and lived in a big house. In this life review, I realized how irrelevant all these things were, how little value they had. But moments like laughing with the children and playing hide and seek were very important all of a sudden. I realized how everything opened up inside me and that an incredibly deep feeling of happiness bloomed inside me.
Sometimes it is said that near-death experiences are actually near-life experiences. Has your attitude to life changed due to your experience? What does life or liveliness mean to you?
Das kam dann, als ich wieder in meinem Körper zurück war.
That change came when I returned to my body. My life turned by 180 degrees. When I was back, my body looked anything but beautiful. They had shaved off my hair, my face had been transplanted, my hands had been transplanted. I was wrapped in thick cloth. I didn't recognize myself in the mirror. Nevertheless, I left the hospital at my own risk very quickly. Only 2 days after I'd been released from the intensive care ward. Because I knew from now on everything would be okay. I was so embedded in this spiritual love, this feeling that I was carried and safe, that I knew I wouldn't need a doctor or a hospital anymore. So I came home and quickly realized that everything I had lived before, all the things that had been important to me, didn't play a role in my life anymore. This included my marriage, my friends, food I had eaten, clothes I had worn, the interior of our apartment. Everything seemed wrong. All those things seemed like a mask. Everything felt so unreal. Nothing seemed to be alive. It seemed as dead as my life before the near-death experience. So as soon as I was able to move again quite reasonably, I sorted out everything. I threw out a lot of things and also gave them away. I couldn't have a normal conversation anymore. I wasn't interested in the TV anymore. I listened to a lot of radio, but not to the things they were speaking about, the music they were playing. I could stand in front of the TV for hours and watch the snowflakes. Or I would constantly touch fabrics. I had the feeling I was sensing things properly for the first time in my life.
Während also in dieser Zeit im Krankenhaus die Ärzte ihr Leben kämpften.
So, while the doctors were fighting for your life and relatives and friends feared for your life, you experienced something beautiful. Were there moments during your coma where you felt close to your body? When you were transferred back to your body, so to speak?
Ja, mein Lehrer hat mich immer mal wieder in dieses Krankenhaus zurückgebracht. Was ich überhaupt nicht verstanden habe.
Yes, my teacher brought me back to this hospital a few times, which I didn't understand at all. It irritated me because I had already finished with this body and this life. One time something happened that is still bothering me today. Must have been during the time when the doctors cut into my windpipe. During that time, it pulled me back into hospital like a catapult. I'd been on a wonderful spiritual level before. I think it was about the bond with my family, my parents. So something very natural. And all of a sudden, it catapulted me back into this tight body. I could feel its pain again. I felt anger, I felt despair. All those things I hadn't felt during my near-death experience came back again. I noticed how a doctor, very professional but emotionally very cool, cut into my windpipe and performed the surgery. And I yelled at him internally. I said, "Hey, can't you do that more gently? You're hurting me." But he didn't react at all to me. There was a great nurse who was sitting by this bed. She was speaking to this patient in a coma. She always spoke to me in thoughts, relaxed me, and explained that he was the best doctor they had there, and not to worry if he was a bit rough, because he knew exactly what he was doing. I was so happy because this woman made me feel safe. I also thanked her at that moment. She knew that a coma patient would hear and feel what was going on around her.
Die hat gewusst, dass eine Koma-Patientin mit ihrem Bewusstsein hört und fühlt, was hier gerade geschieht.
She instinctively did the right thing.
Und das berührt mich noch heute, weil
It still touches me today because this was very important to me.
so wichtig war für mich.
Then suddenly it pulled me out of this body again.
Ich habe gemerkt, dass diese
I realised that this tightness, that the things we feel as humans, can only be felt in our bodies, when our consciousness is situated in our body.
uns im Körper befinden.
As soon as I let go of my body, everything fell off me again, and I felt free again. I was so glad.
When you finally went back into your body, was this a special, a difficult moment?
It was a bit of a fight.
In diesen ganzen 9 Tagen ging es
For me, those whole 9 days were about having lots of questions.
Fragen,
Questions regarding the meaning of life. Why we humans lose ourselves, why we lose this connection,
warum wir diese Anbindung verlieren.
why we have to make certain experiences. I didn't really understand that for myself.
Der Lehrer erklärte mir
My teacher explained a lot to me and showed me the connections.
Zusammenhänge. Und letztendlich löste ich
Eventually I dissolved in what I call the source today.
Ich hatte plötzlich das Gefühl,
Suddenly I had the feeling that I was fully connected with everything,
zu sein.
with God, with the creation, that I was part of all this.
Und in diesem Moment
At that moment he asked me, "Where do you think you are now?"
was glaubst du, wo du jetzt bist?
And my answer was,
Ich bin so,
"I'm at home.
ich bin angekommen, ich bin
I've arrived. I'm where we all come from." I could hear him laugh then, and he told me, "I'll show you where you are."
zeig dir, wo du bist.
And then he pulled me back into this body.
Körper hinein.
We were going deeper and deeper into the organs, the tissue.
Es ging ins Gewebe.
I could see the blood vessels. He pulled me into my cells.
Zellen hinein.
All of a sudden, I recognized this source in the core of each cell of my body,
Meines Körpers, diese
in which I had been just earlier.
gefunden hatte.
I'll never forget this astonishing moment.
Vergessen, ich war total perplex zu erkennen,
I was completely perplexed because I realized that everything that I'd been looking for out there did exist in me or my body. I then heard the laughter of my teacher again. He said, "You are the embodiment of creation."
und ich glaube, das war für mich der
I think that was the point where I began to like my body again, where I began to see my body with a fresh eye,
Augen zu sehen.
where I unexpectedly perceived a different way of body awareness.
Wahrgenommen habe, wo
It was the moment when I perceived the liveliness of my body and not just its weight,
ich dieses materielle
this material means of transportation as I'd seen it before. But all of a sudden I perceived it as this lively wonder.
wahrgenommen und bin
And eventually today I'd say it was the moment when I was actually incarnated.
inkarniert.
Only then did I begin to inhabit this body again with my whole spiritual consciousness, and I flowed into it and was completely aware of it. It was a feeling as if I'd taken everything with me that would make up my soul, as an energy field, as a consciousness, and that I'd let everything flow into this body. I made sure that I would also flow into my feet and my legs, into the organs and the brain. This was incredible, because I always used to reject this body.
Glauben Sie, dass dieses Hineinfließen auch...
Do you think that this flow also had something to do with this wonderful healing process that you experienced later on?
Ich bin überzeugt davon, denn ich kann es mir anders nicht erklären.
I'm convinced by it. I can't find any other explanation for it. I never had any surgery after that. I didn't have rehab. I just released myself from the hospital, and the rest was done by my body. The one thing I find quite incredible is that I always thought of this near-death experience and that I was at home now. The more levels and areas I experienced, I was always thinking, now I've arrived. And just as I flowed back into this body and inhabited it properly, only then did I realize, now I am at home. And how important this body is for us humans here on Earth.
From your perspective today, why is our body so important?
Because it gives us so much. For me, there isn't much of a difference anymore whether I'm a human here and look out of my eyes, and I'm not able to reach through matter anymore, or whether I exist in my spiritual consciousness over there. Actually, I can perceive both simultaneously. There is no either or anymore, but I live both. But I can't feel as a spirit. Although I am in a state of unconditionality, in a state of peace, in a higher state of consciousness. But these human feelings don't exist over there. Doubt, fears and worries don't exist there either. These things are non-existent there. But we can live them here in this body. We can have an argument and make up again. We are hungry and can cook something great to eat and have the enjoyment of eating. These are all experiences that don't exist as a spirit.
The intensity of experience. Would this term summarize it?
Yes. When I compare my life now and then, I didn't live at the time. Maybe I only lived 5%. Now I live as intensely as possible. Now my perception is a lot more aware. I pay much more attention to myself and my needs. I enjoy life. I don't just function anymore. I especially take care of my feelings, what feels good and what doesn't feel good. I don't judge myself anymore. Life's got a completely different intensity.
From your point of view, do you think this would be the path for everyone, to live life as you've perceived it? In a time-lapse, so to speak?
The funny thing is that we've experienced all these things already. Every child lives in this state. They live in this flow where space and time don't exist. They play, busy themselves with things they enjoy, and then just stop doing something and start something new. And then we are trained away from this. We're raised to make ourselves fit into society.
Versuchen uns passend zu machen für eine Gesellschaft. Und ich glaube, genau da setzt im Moment dieser Wandel ein.
I think there's a transition happening now where parents and grandparents start to raise their children differently and try not to drive out their spiritual selves.
Ihr seelisches Wesen nicht mehr abzutrainieren. Und ja, darin besteht ein Teil des Sinns des Lebens.
Yes, it is part of the meaning of life to listen to ourselves, to have our own experiences, and to experience our own conflicts. Doesn't mean that life is always easy. It doesn't mean that there won't be any challenges, that we won't face any tests. But I cope with this completely differently. I don't turn anything off. There is nothing I wouldn't be prepared to face anymore, that I'd resist. But instead, I observe what happens in my surroundings or in my life. And somehow I also observe how I react to them. It's very hard to explain. I'm in a sort of perspective of observer or double. I don't know. On the one hand, I experience life like an astonished child. And on the other hand, there is always a big part that observes everything, that is in a state of unconditionality, that is completely neutral, non-judgmental and loving. And I can easily switch between these perspectives. Even if I have doubts, or this human part has doubts, or when this human part doubts or doesn't know how to react, then I can go into this perspective of observation, and I see the higher meaning behind it. Thus, life isn't all that dramatic anymore.
You've experienced something like an immediateness. Now, in normal interpersonal interactions, even while we're speaking here, language has a great significance. What importance does language have for you today?
Well, that's what makes it quite hard for me. Actually, every word is empty. I try to convey something in words that cannot be conveyed. You can only experience it yourself. I try to tell people about it, but I notice that I move them by things I tell them. It's just about this movement. It's not about words at all. Words are like a drop in the ocean. Actually, I could or would like to withdraw to an alpine hut where I wouldn't need to speak anymore. Everything would be fine as it is.
So, language would just be a tool to move people. That is what it's about?
Ja, und ich glaube, wir Menschen nehmen uns gegenseitig mit unseren Sinnen.
Yes, I believe we perceive each other with our senses, especially the senses we're not aware of. And this works on many levels: facial expressions, gestures, and the tone of a voice. I think we also sense each other's feelings, so that words are just a little aid.
In ideological debates, there is often a strict differentiation between the body and the soul, which is kind of a black and white way of thinking. Here is the physical, the living, that divides itself from the body after death. And the question as to how the non-material influences the material is often unanswered. I assume this viewpoint appears quite constructed after experiencing a holistic world. Am I right here?
Well, what does constructed mean? It's the viewpoint of people who haven't experienced what I have experienced. If they'd even experienced a fraction of what I have experienced, they'd immediately dismiss their entire views and ideas. For me, this body was created in order to have experiences I need for myself as a human. And this body is just alive because I inhabit it with my consciousness. I used to say it's like a car which I get into, and then I put it to bed or park it and get out of it again. It's not that simple. A big part of my consciousness stays in my body. But for me, my body is like a mouthpiece on this human, material level. I don't share this either-or way of thinking at all. Everything is an as-well way of thinking. We exist multidimensionally, and that is permanent. Even if we believe in 3D and are bound to space and time, we are still multidimensional beings. We switch constantly between various levels and areas of our consciousness. It's just that we don't notice it. We don't realize it.
Regarding the topic of switching, you briefly mentioned that you also experienced elements and moments of former lives on Earth. What experiences do you connect with the topic of reincarnation?
Oh, es war spannend. Ich habe erlebt.
It was exciting. I asked about the meaning of life again. My teacher showed me that I had had various experiences in former lives. Once I was fat, another time I was skinny. I was rich, I was poor. Once I was the predator, another time the victim. I wasn't all those things just once, but several times. One time I was an alcoholic, and another time a teetotaler. I had all the experiences that were possible during those lives. I incorporated them and connected them with each other. They took place in various periods of time. And then I even became aware that these periods didn't exist, but that they existed simultaneously. Actually, if you like, there is just this present, and there is just this one moment. I'm experiencing myself in this consciousness, in this year, during this conversation with you. But simultaneously, all my other realities are taking place as well. It's hard to describe. I'm sure a quantum scientist would be better at explaining this.
If we, let's say, dip into the aspect of space and time, what happened after this intense experience physically, and how did you cope with your earthly, everyday life?
Rein körperlich war das am Anfang erstmal sehr schwierig.
At the beginning it was extremely difficult, seen from a purely physical perspective. Because all my senses were wide open. My senses of hearing and sight were so sensitive. I sensed all the material and spiritual levels at the same time. I knew what my husband was feeling. I heard what my son was thinking. Also, I perceived everything simultaneously. And I was completely overtaxed by this. For example, I was supposed to lie down on a pillow, and I couldn't take this pillow anymore because I could feel the pain of the geese that had been robbed of their feathers. I'd touched certain clothes and couldn't wear them anymore because I knew where they had been produced and how they'd been transported. Clothes contained all this information, and I was able to retrieve it. I thought I'd go crazy because it was just too much for me. If you walk over a wooden floor and you know where it comes from, then this is just too much. You can't focus on yourself anymore. That's how I learned why the ego is developed, why we need this protective wall. If our senses were that open to everything, we'd never be able to focus on ourselves. We'd never say anything bad about people in front of them, because we'd know right away what the other person would feel. For me, this was a very life-changing event, and very intense. So then I learned that I could separate this from myself. It calmed down, together with my perception, and I started to sort out everything in my life, things I didn't feel good about anymore, everything that didn't comply with my truth or the new feeling of me.
And all those things that you had experienced, were you able to classify them? Were you aware that you'd had a near-death experience?
No, I was not able to classify them. That was only possible years later. I didn't know at all what had happened to me. I carried this with me like some treasure. I didn't even dare talk about it. I tried to do it partially a few times. But at first I had to process these experiences by myself. I thought I'd gone crazy. But on the other hand, I knew I'd never been as aware and fulfilled as now. But all of a sudden, my whole life was completely different. That was a big challenge. Eventually, it took me 4 years to change my life. I wasn't able to continue in my old job. I wasn't able to live my relationship the way it was, and I couldn't live in my house anymore. I no longer dealt with many things that had been important to me in the past, and I was allowed to relearn everything. Like a small child, what are the things I like doing? What kind of people do I like to meet up with? What kind of things do I like to talk about? Would I like to read now or go outside? I hadn't known all these things before. In my life, I had focused so much on the needs of others that I had to relearn everything.
How long did it take you until you were able to speak about all these things as openly as you are able to now?
It took me 8 years. 2 years ago, it was the first time I opened up about it in great detail.
Erst einmal davon ausführlich berichtet. Und dann dadurch kam ein Verlag auf mich zu und bat mich dringend.
That's how a publisher approached me and urged me to write my story. But even today, I'm still looking for the right words. I believe I'll never get used to the fact that I won't ever be able to do justice to what I've experienced. I think it's not possible to do this in words.
Your world of experience today, how can we envision it? Do you still have a connection to the spiritual world, to your teacher?
Yes. When my teacher asked me to go back into this body, or whether I wanted to go back, I was scared of 2 things. Firstly, that my body would stay as disfigured as it was at the time, and secondly, that I would lose this connection with my teacher, that I'd lose this connection on the spiritual level. And he promised me that this wouldn't happen. And that is what really happened. Today I have the feeling that I live in both worlds simultaneously. And I can't just switch back and forth, but that I perceive these parallels too. On the one hand, I'm in this conversation, but on the other hand, I'm on higher levels in my consciousness. This is what's stayed. It's phenomenal. When I speak to people today, I notice that my teacher intervenes and that he's present. There's no separation. It didn't exist before, and it doesn't exist now either.
Today, you work as a coach. What do you offer exactly? Have you developed a certain approach?
No, because I can't deliberate anymore. I can no longer make plans. I can only act spontaneously now. And that's a little difficult. When I speak in front of people, I can't plan in advance what I'd like to tell them or what the topic will be about. But I look at what might develop in a certain moment. That's why I don't have any tools. My cause is to inspire people with my story so they can rethink their lives. I'd like them to benefit from my story, so they stop being so hard on themselves, so they start listening to their feelings, their intuition, and maybe change their lives. I'd like to move people. I'd like to remind them of themselves. That's what I do by telling them about myself.
Auf Ihrer Homepage schreiben Sie im Hinblick auf die verbreitete Angst vor dem Tod.
On your homepage, you write about the common fear of death, and that it's actually the fear of life. Is that an important conclusion drawn from your experience with people?
Yes. I think that most people are not afraid of death. They might be afraid of the way they will die, but not of death itself. However, we're extremely scared of loving ourselves. We don't want to hurt anybody. We want to fit into society. We want to be part of society, but have no idea how to. Many people are extremely scared to live their individuality. They get to a point in life that can be compared to a one-way road that becomes narrower and narrower, and eventually they realize they can't go any further. Or their body shows them these steps of transition in the form of an illness, or something happens on the outside. Some people change their point of view only then concerning certain areas that are really important. It was the same for me. If this accident with the fire hadn't occurred, I would still be an empty puppet today.
You wrote a book about your experiences with the title 9 Days of Eternity. Your book turned out to be a bestseller. 9 editions have already been published. You've also made an audiobook with your own voice. Do you have a follow-up project in mind?
Yes, currently I'm working on a second book. I'm curious as to how it's going to turn out. It's partly about what am I going to do with all this knowledge? How can the reader implement it in practice if they want to change their life, but don't know how?
Ms. Evertz, I wish you all the best for writing your second book, a lot of inspiration, and success for your work. And many thanks for this interview.
Thank you.